Hey everyone, welcome back to Medieval Historian. Today, we're diving into one of the darkest corners of history, the lived reality of women in the Middle Ages. This video is about the pain they endured, the freedoms they never had, and the cruelty that shaped every stage of their lives. From being married off as children, to dying in childbirth, to being beaten or burned simply for speaking out, life wasn't just difficult for medieval women, it was pure hell. Now think about the world we live in today. Women can vote, study, build careers, raise their voices, and challenge injustice. Things still aren't perfect, but the amount of freedom and recognition women have fought for and gained is astonishing compared to the past. Back then, a woman could be punished simply for reading a book, wearing the wrong color, or being born with the wrong kind of beauty. Her body wasn't her own. Her choices were made by others. And even in death, many were buried without a name, their lives forgotten by the very world that oppressed them. So, before we begin and before you get too comfortable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? I'm just a nerd who loves digging into history's darkest corners, and it always blows my mind to see people tuning in from all over the world. You guys make this journey even more amazing. This is why life was pure hell for women in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, a girl's life began with something quieter than a cry. It began with a societal silence that wrapped itself around her future like a shroud. From the moment she was born, she was seen not as a person with potential, but as a burden to be managed, a mouth to feed until she could be married off. Her birth might be met with polite joy, but make no mistake, unless she was born into nobility, and even then only if her dowry would serve a purpose, she was never the desired heir. Sons inherited land, titles, and names. Daughters inherited silence. She wouldn't be educated. She wouldn't be asked her opinion. From her first steps, her life was a slow march towards servitude, first to her father, then her husband, and eventually, if she survived long enough, to her sons. Girls were taught to lower their gaze, speak softly, and never interrupt. And if a girl was naturally bold, curious, or loud, that spirit would be quickly corrected. To be a good girl was to be obedient, modest, and invisible when needed. Even play was controlled. Boys could mimic sword fights and hunt in the fields, but girls were expected to mimic chores, caring for dolls, practicing sewing, sweeping the floor with tiny brooms made of straw. If a girl showed signs of intelligence, if she asked too many questions, or picked up a book left carelessly on a table, her curiosity was either ignored or punished. Reading was often considered unnecessary, even dangerous for women. What could a girl possibly need with knowledge of the world, of scripture, of trade, or law? Her world was meant to be domestic, small, and tightly confined. For noble girls, silence was dressed in velvet. For peasant girls, it was woven into linen and blistered hands. This silence wasn't just social, it was spiritual, too. The church taught that woman was created from man, for man, that Eve was the cause of original sin, that suffering in silence was the path to virtue. And so, this narrative was reinforced from cradle to grave. A girl learned early that speaking out could mean shame, ridicule, or worse. There was no room for her story, no space for her dreams, only the expectations of others. To be born a girl in the Middle Ages was to enter a world already determined, where silence wasn't golden, it was expected, and the weight of that silence would only grow heavier with time. While boys might have been given a few short years to play or explore their world, girls were thrust into responsibility almost from the moment they could walk. A medieval girl's childhood wasn't a time of freedom. It was a period of quiet apprenticeship, preparation for a lifetime of servitude that would begin with her own family and continue under the control of her husbands. There was no space for innocence. A girl learned early that idleness wasn't allowed, and joy had to wait. She might begin with carrying water from the well, a task that required balance and strength far beyond her years. If she dropped the bucket or spilled too much, there was scolding or worse. By the time she was 7 or 8, she was expected to help with cooking, weaving, spinning, tending animals, gathering firewood, and caring for her younger siblings. She worked beside her mother and older sisters from dawn to dusk, absorbing the rhythm of labor like breath. Her hands became calloused, her back began to ache before she ever learned to read, and her eyes were trained on the needs of others before she could truly understand her own. For girls born to farming families, the days could be brutal. Tending to livestock in freezing winds, collecting dung for fuel, cleaning soiled cloths, and assisting in fieldwork during harvest. There was no praise for endurance, only the expectation of more. And if she failed, if she showed fatigue, if she made a mistake, the blame was swift. There was no room for weakness in a household barely surviving. She had to be strong, but never proud, capable, but never assertive. Even in wealthier homes, girlhood meant rigid routines. Noble daughters were trained not for freedom, but for control. They learned how to manage a household, entertain guests, obey husbands, and produce heirs. Their days were filled with embroidery, etiquette, and long hours under the scrutiny of governesses. They may have eaten better and worn finer fabric, but their days were just as devoid of joy. Their work was simply cloaked in politeness and appearances. For all girls, laughter was fleeting. Most memories were tied to duties, to discipline, to silent tears shed during chores that seemed never-ending. Childhood wasn't a time of discovery, it was a dress rehearsal for submission. And any light they found, be it in a moment of stolen play, a song sung while working, or a warm glance from a tired mother, was fleeting, rare, precious. In the Middle Ages, a girl's childhood was not her own. It belonged to the people she served, the labor she performed, and the silence she was expected to keep. In the rigid hierarchy of the medieval world, women were never seen as independent individuals. From the moment they entered adolescence, girls were no longer just daughters. They became assets to be managed, traded, or claimed. A woman's value was rarely connected to her thoughts, her hopes, or her talents. Instead, her body, her lineage, and her potential to bear children defined her worth. She was not a person in the eyes of the law or her community. She was property. Fathers controlled every detail of their daughters' futures. They could choose whom she married, when she left the household, and what portion of her dowry would go with her. Consent was rarely sought because it simply didn't matter. Legally and socially, a girl belonged first to her father. Upon marriage, ownership transferred to her husband. This wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. In many regions, women could not own land, could not inherit titles, and had no legal standing in court without a male guardian. Her body, her labor, and her offspring all belonged to the man in charge of her life. The Church, far from being a refuge, reinforced this view. Religious teachings emphasized a woman's duty to submit, to serve, to obey. Marriage was often portrayed as a holy bond, but only if the wife remained entirely under her husband's authority. The idea of mutual partnership didn't exist in any meaningful sense. Wives were to honor and obey. Husbands were to rule and discipline. If she disobeyed, he could punish her. If she ran, she could be dragged home. This view of women as property extended beyond marriage. If a woman was raped, the crime was considered a violation of her father's or husband's rights, not her own bodily autonomy. Compensation, if any, went to the male relative, not the victim. Her trauma was secondary to the insult delivered to her owner. If she was unwed and assaulted, her value dropped, not her attackers. And while noble women might have enjoyed more comfortable lives, they too were pawns in a larger game. Their marriages were often arranged for alliances, land, and power, not affection. Their movements were watched, their letters intercepted, and their fertility obsessed over. A noblewoman who failed to produce heirs could be cast aside, cloistered, or worse, accused of being cursed, barren, or unfaithful. Across all classes, women lived with the constant reminder that they were not free. Their futures were negotiated in rooms they couldn't enter. Their voices were ignored in decisions that shaped their entire lives. They were possessions dressed in fabric and forced smiles, moving through a world that never truly saw them. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not the culmination of love or the beginning of mutual partnership. It was a transaction, often cold and calculating, forged to secure alliances, merge properties, or produce heirs. For women, especially, it marked the beginning of a new kind of captivity. The ceremony might have involved music, feasts, and vows, but beneath the celebration was a truth few dared to say aloud. The woman had no power in the union, and often no choice. Girls were married off young, sometimes as early as 12 or 13, when their bodies had barely begun to change. The man they were given to might be twice their age or older, a stranger they'd never met, a figure with a title or a sword, but not a heart they knew. These unions were not questioned because questioning meant rebellion, and rebellion, especially for women, came with a price. Once married, a woman's life narrowed further. Her husband became her lord. She was expected to obey him in all things, to tend his home, bear his children, remain faithful, and ask no questions. The law protected his authority, even when it became violent. A husband could beat his wife, and it would not be seen as cruelty, it would be seen as discipline. Her bruises weren't signs of abuse, they were signs of obedience not learned fast enough. And if she failed to conceive, blame fell swiftly. Even if her husband was the source of infertility, she carried the weight of shame. Whispers spread quickly. Was she cursed? Was she a witch? Was God punishing her for sins she didn't even remember committing? The pressure to bear children, especially sons, was suffocating, and women endured endless cycles of pregnancy, childbirth, and loss, with no guarantee of kindness or survival. Affection in marriage was a luxury, not an expectation. Some women found kindness, even love, in their husbands, but this was rare and never guaranteed. For most, marriage was simply another form of work, endless days filled with service, submission, and silence. The smile of a wife was a performance, her sadness a private burden. In medieval society, to be a wife was to be bound, not just legally, but physically, emotionally, and spiritually. It was a status that offered no exit, no appeal, and no mercy. And the tragedy of it all was that it was considered honorable, holy, something to aspire to. In the Middle Ages, girlhood was fleeting. There was no extended adolescence, no gentle transition into adulthood. Instead, a girl could find herself a bride before she was even old enough to understand what marriage truly meant. 12 was not too young, 14 was common. By modern standards, these were children, but in medieval society they were considered ready, ready to marry, ready to serve, ready to bear children. What mattered most was not emotional maturity or personal will, it was biology. If she could menstruate, she could marry. This was especially true among noble families, where alliances needed to be forged quickly and bloodlines carefully managed. Fathers arranged marriages with urgency, viewing daughters as tools for diplomacy or economic gain. A young girl's wedding was not a celebration of love, it was a transaction signed and sealed long before she ever met her future husband. Sometimes the groom was only a few years older. Other times he was decades her senior. In either case, the power imbalance was immense. A child bride was expected to assume the role of wife, homemaker, and mother before she had time to discover herself. The consequences were devastating. Physically, childbirth at such a young age posed serious risks. A girl's body, not fully developed, could be torn apart during labor. Infection, hemorrhage, and death were tragically common. Emotionally, the trauma of being forced into adulthood, of leaving home, bedding a stranger, and living under the strict control of a husband was overwhelming. Many suffered in silence, with no one to turn to and nowhere to run. Even outside noble circles, among peasants, early marriage was a way to ensure labor, secure alliances, or relieve economic burden. A daughter married off meant one less mouth to feed, one less risk of dishonor, one more chance to survive winter. There were exceptions, of course. Some families delayed marriage until their daughters were older. Some girls entered nunneries instead. And in rare cases, affection grew between young brides and their husbands. But these were the outliers. The rule was clear: a girl's body belonged to her father until it could be handed over to a husband. Her age was measured not in years, but in usefulness. And through it all, her voice was almost never heard. Whether she wept, begged, or stayed silent out of fear, it made no difference. The marriage would proceed, the bed would be shared. The childhood would end. In medieval society, marriage was never just about the union of two people. It was about assets. Negotiations, not affection, drove the process, and at the heart of it all was the dowry. For every daughter, a dowry was not just a gift, it was her price tag. It was the value her family attached to her, and the sum another family expected in exchange for taking her in. The weight of the dowry wasn't symbolic, it was very real, and it defined a woman's fate. The dowry might include land, livestock, coins, jewelry, clothing, or even promises of future service. In wealthier families, it could be vast and ceremonial, carted in on wagons, and counted out in front of witnesses. For the poor, it was whatever they could spare: a goat, a bolt of cloth, a few sacks of grain. But regardless of class, the message was the same: this girl comes with a price. And if that price wasn't paid, her chances of marriage diminished sharply. This financial burden often dictated a girl's entire life. Families might go into debt to provide a dowry, selling off pieces of land or livestock, betting everything on a single match. Others gave daughters to the church, not out of spiritual devotion, but because they couldn't afford to marry them off. In that sense, poverty didn't just limit options, it sealed destinies. A girl without a dowry was often viewed as unworthy, even cursed. Some remained unmarried not by choice, but by economic rejection. The cruelty of this system was how deeply it tied a woman's value to wealth. Love didn't matter. Kindness, intelligence, character, none of these were bargaining chips. What mattered was what she brought with her, and if her dowry failed to satisfy her husband or his family, she might be mistreated, shunned, or sent back in disgrace. In some regions, dowries were returned only if the wife died without children. Her value extended even into death. There were also cases where women's dowries were stolen, misused, or withheld. If her husband died, she might be left with nothing. She had no legal recourse. The money was his. Her future, uncertain. And if she outlived him but bore no sons, she could lose even the home she'd lived in for decades. For many women, the dowry was the first and last piece of personal property they would ever be associated with, yet even that wasn't truly theirs. It was handled by men, exchanged like cattle, and used as a tool to control their lives. A woman's body, her future, her social status, it was all wrapped in the cold arithmetic of what she was worth. A wedding in the Middle Ages might appear, at first glance, to be a moment of celebration. There would be guests, music, and a feast. But behind the garlands and cloaks was a truth few acknowledged. For the bride, this was not a joyous event. It was a sentence carried out in public, a ceremony without consent. Because the reality was this: choice played almost no role in a medieval woman's marriage. Whether she was a noble or a peasant, her fate was determined by others. Most brides met their grooms on the day of the wedding or shortly before. It didn't matter if she was frightened, uncomfortable, or simply didn't want to marry. Her opinion was irrelevant. In many places, consent was required by the church in theory, but in practice, that yes could be coerced, whispered under pressure, or assumed altogether. A girl's silence was taken as compliance. Her resistance, if voiced at all, was quickly suppressed by the insistence of family or the authority of priests. She might have longed for someone else, she might have feared what lay ahead, but none of that mattered. The match had been made, the dowry settled, and the household prepared. It was her duty to obey. Her reluctance was seen as childish, sinful, or ungrateful. Even tears were ignored. They weren't uncommon. Everyone expected her to cry. It was part of the performance. The wedding itself reinforced her lack of power. The ceremony emphasized her submission, both to God and to her husband. Her vows were promises of obedience. The man pledged to provide and protect. The woman pledged to serve and submit. The entire ritual mirrored the hierarchy of medieval life, male authority above all, female compliance beneath it. Her name would often be changed, her identity absorbed into his, her world now controlled by the home she entered, not the one she came from. After the ceremony, the new bride would be led away. Sometimes paraded through the streets, sometimes carried over thresholds, sometimes locked in a room for the bedding ceremony, a tradition where the consummation of the marriage was witnessed or recorded by others. The public interest in this private act was disturbing, humiliating, and all too common. A woman's most intimate moments were not her own. And so the wedding marked the end of any illusion of freedom. Whatever hopes she might have clung to as a girl were now behind her. Her future belonged to a man she didn't choose, and whose kindness or cruelty would shape the rest of her life. Once the vows were spoken and the celebration faded, the true nature of marriage revealed itself. For a medieval woman, marriage was not a shared life. It was servitude, cloaked in tradition. From the moment she entered her husband's home, obedience was not requested, it was demanded. Her role was to be quiet, loyal, industrious, and above all, compliant. The husband was the ruler of the household, and the wife his subordinate. The expectations were clear and relentless. She was to manage the home, prepare meals, raise children, tend the garden, care for livestock if needed, and ensure that all domestic affairs ran smoothly. Her labor was constant, uncelebrated, and expected. But physical tasks were only part of the burden. Emotional submission was perhaps the heaviest chain. She had no say in important decisions, no authority to manage money, and no voice in how the household was run. Disagreement was seen as disrespect. Resistance was rebellion. The law supported this hierarchy. A husband could discipline his wife as he saw fit. Courts rarely intervened unless the violence was extreme, and even then, it was more likely that the woman would be blamed for provoking it. The church encouraged wives to endure suffering patiently, urging forgiveness and prayer over justice. Stories of saints included women who tolerated years of abuse with grace, held up as holy examples of virtue. Some women found subtle ways to assert themselves through influence over their children, quiet manipulation of household resources, or whispered alliances with servants or neighbors. But these were small acts, and always done carefully. One wrong move, one rumor of defiance, could lead to ruin. A disobedient wife might be cast out, humiliated, or even sent to a convent against her will. In the worst cases, she could be beaten into submission or accused of witchcraft if she was too clever or outspoken. This wasn't a life of partnership, it was a lifelong performance. The smile on her face, the grace in her posture, the silence on her lips, they were all part of a mask she was forced to wear. And behind that mask was exhaustion, fear, resentment that could never be voiced, because a medieval woman didn't just obey her husband, she obeyed a world that never once asked her what she wanted. Pregnancy, in theory, should have been a sacred and joyous time, a moment of hope, continuity, and preparation for new life. But for women in the Middle Ages, pregnancy was a source of fear more than celebration. It was a gamble played with the body and soul, and the odds were rarely in a woman's favor. From the very first signs of conception, a woman entered a state of anxious waiting. She carried not just the physical burden of pregnancy, but the spiritual weight of expectations and the looming shadow of death. There was no medical safety net. Midwives were skilled, often deeply respected within their communities, but they lacked the tools, knowledge, and support to handle complications. Hospitals, if they existed at all nearby, were places of last resort, often filled with disease and despair. Physicians rarely attended to childbirth unless the family was wealthy, and even then, their understanding of female anatomy was woefully limited and often filtered through religious dogma rather than science. Pregnant women were expected to continue working through their pregnancies, cooking, cleaning, caring for other children, and serving their husbands. Rest was rare and often discouraged, even viewed as laziness. If she suffered from morning sickness, fatigue, or swelling, she had to endure it quietly. Complaining could be seen as a lack of piety or strength. Pregnancy was her duty, and any suffering was just part of the cost. The pressure to deliver a male heir added to the strain. A woman's social standing, even her marriage, could be at risk if she failed to produce sons. Miscarriages were mourned in secret, often blamed on the mother for working too hard, eating the wrong thing, or harboring some hidden sin. Superstition ran rampant, charms were worn, prayers whispered, herbs brewed not for comfort, but survival. Every pain was interpreted, every movement of the child in the womb scrutinized for meaning. A difficult pregnancy could be seen as punishment from God or a sign of demonic interference. And even if all went smoothly, there was the delivery to face, a moment many women dreaded more than anything. There was no pain relief, no sanitation, no reliable help in the event of complications. A breech birth, twins, or excessive bleeding could mean death within hours. Women often made peace with their mortality before labor began. It was not uncommon for wives to confess their sins, settle their wills, and say goodbye to loved ones before giving birth. Pregnancy was not a celebration of life. It was a battlefield fought in silence. And even in survival, the fear never really left, only the expectation to do it all over again. If pregnancy was filled with fear, childbirth was the moment that fear became reality. In the Middle Ages, giving birth was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could endure. There were no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no sterile equipment, and no concept of germ theory. A woman entered the birthing chamber knowing that she might not leave it alive. And yet, she did it again and again, sometimes every year, for most of her adult life. When labor began, the woman was often surrounded by female relatives, neighbors, and a midwife. These women formed what was called the gossip's circle, a sacred, supportive space in theory, but one also filled with anxiety. If anything went wrong, there was little they could do. A labor that lasted too long could exhaust the mother beyond recovery. A baby stuck in the birth canal, a torn womb, excessive bleeding, all could quickly become fatal. Midwives used herbs, oils, prayers, and positioning techniques, but when complications escalated, they had few options. There were no cesarean sections as we know them today. A breech birth could kill both mother and child. And yet, women were expected to endure the pain in silence, without crying out. Screaming during labor could be interpreted as a sign of weakness or lack of virtue. In some places, it was believed that suffering during childbirth was Eve's punishment passed down to all women. Therefore, pain was part of their spiritual duty. Some women were even denied help until they recited prayers or repented for sins, as if childbirth were a form of confession. The trauma didn't end with the delivery. If the baby survived and the mother did not, the child would be taken and raised by wet nurses, stepmothers, or monasteries. If the mother survived but the child died, she was often blamed. Either way, her grief had little space to exist. Mourning was private, and the expectation to recover quickly was intense. After all, there was still work to do, more children to bear, a household to manage. In noble families, there were midwives with more experience, but even they could do little against severe bleeding or infection. And in many cases, pressure to produce a son led noble women to take risks, birthing again before their bodies had healed, continuing pregnancies well into fragile health, and dying from exhaustion long before old age. Childbirth was not just dangerous, it was routine, expected, and despite the blood, pain, and death, there were no monuments, no honors, no glory for the women who endured it. Only silence, and another empty place at the table. The loss of a child at birth in the Middle Ages was more than a tragedy. It was often treated as a curse. Stillbirths were heartbreakingly common. Malnutrition, infection, harsh labor conditions, and the total absence of prenatal care meant that countless babies were born lifeless or died shortly after. But while the grief was real, it was rarely acknowledged with sympathy. Instead, it was buried beneath suspicion, superstition, and shame. And as with most things in medieval society, the woman bore the blame. When a baby was born dead, whispers followed. Had the mother sinned? Had she eaten something impure? Had she worked too hard or not prayed enough? Even in cases where the cause was clearly natural, fevers during pregnancy, premature labor, poor nourishment, people sought spiritual or moral explanations. The idea that a woman could lose a child through no fault of her own was often dismissed. The Church emphasized divine punishment and original sin, reinforcing the notion that suffering, including the loss of a child, was part of a woman's spiritual burden. Worse still, if a baby died before it could be baptized, it was often denied burial in consecrated ground. The mother's grief was magnified by the belief that her child's soul might be lost forever, left to drift in limbo. She wasn't just mourning a child, she was tormented by fears of eternal damnation for the baby she carried for months, birthed in agony, and held only briefly. In some areas, families would secretly baptize stillborns with water and prayers, desperate to give the child a chance at peace, even if unofficially. The psychological toll on women was immense. Stillbirth brought sorrow, but also isolation. A grieving mother was expected to return to her duties quickly. There was no formal mourning period for a lost infant. In noble households, the pressure to conceive again could begin almost immediately, especially if the child had been a male heir. Among peasants, a dead baby meant one less mouth to feed, and sometimes that cold calculation overshadowed compassion. Life moved on. She had to, too. The pain was private and unspoken. There were no portraits painted, no names recorded in most cases. Entire generations of children and their mother's pain were erased from history by the silence of the time. And yet, for every stillbirth, there was a woman who remembered. Who carried the memory in her bones? Who held the weight of life and death in a world that never stopped to ask how she felt? Even when a medieval woman successfully gave birth and her child survived, her place in that child's life was never truly secure. In many ways, she was seen as a vessel, important for delivery, but secondary once the child was born. The authority over the child, legally and socially, belonged to the father. And if the father died, the guardianship typically transferred to another male relative, or the church, not the mother. This reality cut across social classes. In noble families, children, especially sons, were viewed as heirs and political assets. Their upbringing was closely managed by male advisors, tutors, and clergy. Mothers might be permitted to nurture their babies in early infancy, but once the child could walk and talk, they were often taken away to be raised in separate quarters, schooled in the ways of men. Their training in leadership, war, law, and estate management had no room for the mother's influence. Daughters, meanwhile, might remain in the household longer, but were still subject to the authority of the father or male guardian. The mother could advise, but not decide. Her opinion mattered only if permitted. In peasant homes, a mother might have more day-to-day control over her children, feeding them, clothing them, teaching them how to work, but this was labor, not authority. If her husband chose to apprentice the son to a distant trade or marry off the daughter at 14, she had no legal say. If she objected, she risked punishment. The law did not recognize her as a guardian in her own right. The most brutal expression of this lack of power came during widowhood or abandonment. If a woman's husband died, she might lose custody of her children to male relatives, especially if property or titles were involved. If she remarried, the new husband often had no obligation to care for the children from her first marriage. In some cases, children were taken into monasteries or sent to other households, tearing them away from the only parent who had loved and cared for them consistently. A mother's emotional connection to her children was strong, but always at risk. Even breastfeeding, seen as a symbol of maternal care today, was often outsourced in noble households to wet nurses. In that system, love was secondary to social structure. Blood ties existed, but the rights that should have come with them did not. And so, medieval women lived with the haunting truth that they could give life, but not claim it. They raised their children in the shadow of a system that saw them as caretakers, not parents. Their arms could cradle a child, but the child's fate was never in their hands. In a society where a woman's worth was largely measured by her ability to bear children, especially sons, infertility was seen not as a medical issue, but as a personal and moral failure. A woman who could not conceive was viewed with suspicion, pity, or scorn. Whispers followed her in the marketplace. Servants gossiped behind her back. And husbands, depending on their status, could abandon her, replace her, or punish her. In the Middle Ages, being infertile was not just a private sorrow, it was a public condemnation. The pressure to produce heirs was most intense among the nobility. Dynasties depended on bloodlines, and without sons to inherit land or titles, families faced ruin. A wife who failed to conceive quickly, or at all, was often blamed entirely. The idea that a man might be infertile was rarely considered. Male virility was tied to power and pride. But a woman's barrenness? That was weakness, sin, sometimes even witchcraft. In some cases, husbands sought annulments. The church might approve if there was sufficient proof of childlessness, and the woman would be discarded, sometimes sent to a convent or returned to her family in shame. Others stayed married, but endured constant humiliation, barbed comments from in-laws, icy treatment from their husbands, or the unbearable sorrow of watching concubines brought in to bear children in their place. Even among peasants, where inheritance mattered less, an infertile wife was a liability. A barren womb was one less worker, one less mouth to carry the family name, one more excuse for cruelty. Superstition clung tightly to these women. Some were told they were cursed. Others were ordered to wear charms or undergo bizarre rituals, drinking certain herbs, bathing in strange waters, or visiting shrines said to cure barrenness. There was no understanding of hormonal imbalance, no concept of reproductive health, just endless blame, empty remedies, and isolation. But perhaps the worst punishment was internal. Many of these women longed for children. They watched friends cradle infants and felt the ache of absence deepen. They endured invasive questions, unkind laughter, and endless silence. And through it all, they had to continue their chores, play the obedient wife, and pretend they were not slowly unraveling inside. To be infertile in the Middle Ages was to carry a scar that never showed, a wound not of the body, but of the heart, reopened every day by a world that could not understand and did not care to try. For a medieval woman, the death of her husband could mean more than heartbreak. It could mean the collapse of her entire world. Widowhood was not a gateway to independence. It was often a trap of vulnerability. A woman without a husband lost not just a partner, but legal status, financial security, and protection. Unless she had powerful family ties or exceptional luck, her future was placed entirely in the hands of others, usually men who viewed her as a leftover, a burden, or a threat. If she had children, especially sons, she might be allowed to remain in the family home, at least until her sons came of age. But even then, she held power only as a placeholder. The estate, the livestock, the inheritance, it all belonged to the heir. She managed it temporarily, under the gaze of male guardians, church authorities, or feudal lords. Any mistake, any accusation could see her stripped of those rights in an instant. If she had no children, or if her children were daughters, her position was even weaker. She might be pressured to remarry, quickly and without regard to her wishes, or sent to live with male relatives who expected her to work in silence. Some widows entered convents, not out of faith, but because they had nowhere else to go. Others became beggars, their only shelter the poorhouse or the streets. In towns and villages, a lone woman without male protection was often seen as dangerous or immoral, easy prey for slander, suspicion, or worse. There were rare exceptions. Some wealthy widows held onto their lands and wielded quiet power, particularly in merchant cities or among minor nobles. But this was not the norm. Most widows had no voice in legal disputes. They could not bring lawsuits without a male guardian. They were often left out of wills entirely. And even if their husbands had made promises of provision, those promises could vanish in the hands of greedy in-laws or corrupt officials. Socially, the widow walked a tightrope. She was expected to grieve, but not for too long. Remarry, but not seem eager. Dress in mourning, but not draw attention. Show piety, but not ambition. If she was too quiet, she was weak. If she was too outspoken, she was suspicious. Some even found themselves accused of poisoning their husbands, a convenient excuse for powerful men looking to seize property. Widowhood in the Middle Ages was not freedom, it was exposure, a period where every loss, every vulnerability, and every scar was laid bare before a society that offered no safety net, just more silence, more judgment, and a future shaped by the same hands that had always held power. In theory, dowagerhood, the state of being a widow entitled to a portion of her late husband's estate, should have provided some security for medieval women. But in practice, it was often little more than a fragile privilege constantly at risk. A dowager's legal claims could be ignored, contested, or twisted by male heirs, rival relatives, or local authorities. Instead of peace after a lifetime of service and submission, many dowagers found themselves fighting for the bare minimum, a roof over their head, a bit of income, and the right to be left alone. Custom dictated that a widow receive a dower, a portion of her husband's property designated for her support after his death. But in many cases, this depended entirely on the goodwill of his surviving family. If the heir resented her, if documents were lost or forged, or if no formal arrangements had been made, she could be turned out with nothing. Even when the law was on her side, enforcing those rights required resources and connections most widows simply didn't have. In noble households, dowagers were often tolerated but not respected. They occupied a strange social space, too old to remarry easily, too independent for comfort, and too close to power for some heir's liking. A dowager who tried to exert influence over grandchildren, household affairs, or estate decisions could quickly find herself pushed aside. Some were exiled to remote properties. Others were confined in towers, cloisters, or dull corners of the manor where they were seen but not heard. Among peasants, there were fewer legal protections and even harsher realities. A widow's survival depended on her sons, brothers, or community goodwill. If none of these were available, she might be left to wander or beg. The idea of a woman owning and managing her late husband's tools, land, or livestock alone was deeply unsettling to many. She had to prove herself useful every day, spinning, weaving, nursing grandchildren, just to justify her presence in someone else's home. There were some widows who wielded quiet power. A sharp mind, a good reputation, or a loyal network could allow her to manage affairs successfully. But these cases were the exception. More often, a dowager's life was marked by fear, of eviction, of accusation, of slow abandonment. Her memories of marriage, whether bitter or warm, mattered little. The only thing that mattered now was whether she could still serve a purpose without becoming a burden. And all the while, society told her to be grateful, grateful to be alive, grateful for scraps, grateful for being allowed to age in peace, even if that peace came wrapped in loneliness. In the Middle Ages, knowledge was power, and power was never meant for women. The formal education of girls was discouraged, restricted, or outright forbidden, depending on the time and place. Most girls grew up illiterate, with no access to books, letters, or even basic arithmetic. The idea of a woman reading, thinking, and questioning was threatening to a system built on obedience. A learned woman was considered unnatural, even dangerous, and the higher she rose in intellect, the closer she came to suspicion, ridicule, or persecution. Among noble families, daughters might receive a rudimentary education, but only enough to make them suitable wives. They were taught how to manage a household, read prayers, sew finely, and follow etiquette. Literature, philosophy, theology, and law were reserved for their brothers. Girls were often taught to memorize rather than understand, repeat rather than question. A few noble women defied these norms, hiding books, hiring tutors, or learning alongside brothers in disguise. But if discovered, their curiosity could be punished harshly. For peasant girls, education was nearly impossible. They were expected to contribute to the home from an early age, hauling water, preparing meals, tending crops. Even if a local priest was willing to teach them to read, their families often saw no value in it. Why waste time on books when hands were needed in the fields? And if a girl showed intelligence, it might invite suspicion rather than praise. Religious institutions offered limited opportunities. Some convents taught girls to read the Psalms or copy holy texts, especially if they came from noble families. But even then, the knowledge was tightly controlled. It was meant to reinforce piety, not empower. A nun who asked too many questions, wrote too boldly, or strayed from doctrine could find herself silenced or condemned. Mystics and female visionaries were often seen as holy until they said something inconvenient. Then suddenly they were heretics. The fear of educated women ran deep. It wasn't just that men wanted to hoard knowledge, it was that they feared what women might do with it. A woman who could read might interpret the Bible for herself. She might notice injustice. She might write letters to allies, study the law, or spread ideas. And in a society so delicately balanced on female silence, that was intolerable. So books were locked away, language was denied, curiosity was punished, and generation after generation of brilliant minds were extinguished before they could ever catch fire. In medieval Europe, the legal system was not blind. It saw men and silenced women. A woman's testimony in court was often considered less credible than a man's. Her rights were limited, her presence in legal matters was discouraged, and her ability to defend herself or seek justice was consistently undermined. Whether noble or peasant, accused or accuser, a woman entered the legal arena already at a disadvantage, bound not just by laws but by the cultural belief that she was inherently less rational, more emotional, and thus less trustworthy. Women could not serve as judges, barristers, or jurors. In many places, they could not even speak in court unless a male guardian or husband represented them. If they were victims of crime, especially sexual violence, They faced invasive questioning, social shame, and disbelief. Often, the burden of proof fell entirely on them. If a man denied the crime and there were no witnesses, she was left with nothing but humiliation. In some regions, women were barred from testifying unless the case involved another woman, or unless their statement supported a man's claim. Her truth simply did not carry equal weight. Even in matters that directly affected them, inheritance disputes, land ownership, marriage contracts, women were treated as secondary. A widow might fight for her share of her husband's property, only to be overruled by male relatives. A daughter might lose her dowry if her father died suddenly. And if a woman owed a debt, she could be imprisoned or have her property seized, even if she had no means to contest the charges. Without legal autonomy, she depended entirely on the goodwill of men. There were exceptions, of course. Some noble women acted as regents, handling estates or even commanding troops when their husbands were away. Others won legal victories with the help of sympathetic judges or powerful connections. But these were rare flashes of agency in an overwhelmingly patriarchal system. The average woman had no access to the courts unless dragged there, and no reason to trust the outcome even then. And if a woman did defy the odds and speak boldly in court, her bravery could backfire. She might be accused of slander, rebellion, or heresy. A sharp tongue was dangerous. A public accusation, scandalous. Women were expected to be modest, quiet, obedient, and the law reinforced that expectation at every turn. It didn't matter whether she was right. It only mattered that she wasn't a man. In the Middle Ages, defiance was not a crime, unless you were a woman. A man who challenged authority might be called bold, cunning, or brave. A woman who did the same was labeled dangerous, wicked, or mad. From minor acts of independence to outright resistance, a woman who stepped beyond her prescribed role risked punishment that was swift, public, and often brutal. The forms of defiance could be small: refusing to marry the man chosen for her, speaking too freely in public, questioning a priest, reading forbidden texts, wearing clothing deemed inappropriate. Or they could be large: running away from home, protesting abuse, resisting arrest, or organizing others to act. But no matter the scale, society had one message: stay silent, stay obedient, or suffer the consequences. Punishment took many forms. Public shaming was common. A woman might be paraded through the streets in chains, forced to wear signs declaring her crime, or locked in a pillory while villagers hurled insults and refused. Physical punishment was not uncommon either: beatings, brandings, mutilation. A woman who was perceived as wild might have her hair shaved off, her clothes torn, or be forced to wear humiliating garments. In extreme cases, women were burned, drowned, or buried alive, especially if their defiance was interpreted through the lens of witchcraft or heresy. The public nature of these punishments was intentional. It was a warning to other women: know your place, stay in line. The cruelty wasn't just meant to punish the individual, it was meant to maintain order, to make sure that no other woman got ideas. The irony, of course, was that even quiet women weren't safe. But defiant women, those who dared to think, speak, or act outside the confines of their assigned role, were hunted. If she was poor, her voice was ignored. If she was rich, her power was resented. If she was clever, her intelligence was feared. And if she kept fighting, she became a legend or a corpse. And yet, despite the risks, some women did resist. They ran, they wrote, they fought back. Some survived, some didn't. But every act of defiance, however small, was a rebellion against a world that demanded their silence. And even when history forgot their names, it remembered their punishment. That, too, was part of the system. Convents are often romanticized as peaceful sanctuaries, quiet places of prayer, learning, and refuge. And for a few privileged women in the Middle Ages, that could be true. But for many others, entering a convent was not a choice at all. It was a trap, a final option for the unwanted, the unmarriageable, the disobedient, or the inconvenient. Behind the cloister walls, far from the eyes of society, countless women were hidden, not protected. Young girls were placed in convents as early as age 7. Some families, especially among the nobility, gave their daughters to the church to avoid the cost of a dowry or to secure spiritual favor. A girl might be promised to a religious life before she could even speak in full sentences. By the time she understood her fate, her vows were expected. A refusal could mean disgrace to her family or punishment for herself. Her voice did not matter. The decision had already been made. Life in a convent was strict and often harsh. Days were governed by bells, ruled by prayer, fasting, labor, and silence. Food was sparse, comforts few, and privacy non-existent. Education existed in some communities, but only within strict theological boundaries. A curious nun could be viewed with suspicion. A rebellious one could be beaten, isolated, or accused of consorting with the devil. For many, the convent was less a holy retreat and more a cold prison dressed in veils and scripture. The outside world offered no rescue. A woman who tried to flee the convent faced excommunication or worse, accusations of heresy. Some were hunted down and dragged back. Others vanished entirely. Even if she stayed willingly, her existence was shaped by rules written by men. Her body belonged to the church, her words were censored by doctrine, and her ambitions, if any, were confined to the narrow path of obedience and piety. There were moments of light. Some convents became centers of literacy, medicine, or music. A few nuns achieved fame as mystics, scholars, or composers. But they did so under immense scrutiny, and their success could be used against them as proof of arrogance or sin. For the average nun, there was no glory, only repetition, austerity, and the slow erosion of self. The convent was not a dream of divine sisterhood. It was a shelf on which society placed women it had no use for, wrapping their silence in ritual and calling it salvation. In the medieval imagination, a woman who was too clever, too independent, too strange, or simply too unlucky could find herself branded a witch. The term witch was a cloak society used to cover its deepest fears about women, their knowledge, their sexuality, their defiance. It was not just a spiritual accusation, it was a political one, a social one, and almost always a gendered one. Witchcraft accusations often started with small suspicions, a crop failure, a sick child, an unusual birthmark, or even a quarrel. If a woman was known to use herbs, or if she lived alone, or if she defied a man publicly, these could be enough. Once suspicion took hold, it spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered. Priests warned. And soon, the machinery of fear began to turn. The accused were subjected to horrific ordeals, interrogation, torture, and public humiliation. Their homes were searched for witches' tools, their bodies examined for devil's marks, confessions were extracted through unbearable pain. They were forced to name others, feeding the cycle. Some died before they ever stood trial. Others were marched to the scaffold, burned alive, drowned, or hanged while crowds gathered to watch. The majority of those accused were women, widows, midwives, herbalists, the poor and the old, those on the margins of society. Their crime wasn't real magic. It was power outside male control. The power to heal without permission, to speak without fear, to live without supervision. Church doctrine declared witchcraft a heresy, and civil law followed suit. But the true root of the hysteria was not theology, it was patriarchy. A society built on keeping women silent could not tolerate those who stood apart. Witch trials were not just about punishing evil, they were about silencing women who refused to fit the mold. And the terror worked. Women became afraid to speak too loudly, think too boldly, or live too freely. The risk was too great. one wrong word could end in fire. Witchcraft was not a practice, it was a sentence, and countless women, guilty of nothing but being different, were consumed by it. In the rigid moral framework of the Middle Ages, few accusations destroyed a woman's life faster than adultery. It didn't matter whether the affair was real, imagined, coerced, or a desperate attempt at escape. Once the charge was spoken, the stain was permanent. Adultery for a woman was not just a personal failing in the eyes of medieval society, it was a public scandal, a sin against God, and a threat to the social order. And the consequences were almost always cruel and one-sided. A man who committed adultery might face gossip or religious rebuke, especially if he was caught with another man's wife. But his reputation could recover, his status, inheritance rights, and family name remained intact. In contrast, a woman accused of adultery could lose everything: her dowry, her children, her place in society, and depending on her husband's mood or the local customs, she might be whipped, branded, confined, or even executed. For noble women, adultery was especially dangerous, not because it was more sinful, but because it threatened the bloodline. A child born from an affair could cast doubt on inheritance. A nobleman might spy on his wife, keep her locked in isolated chambers, or employ servants to report on her behavior. If she was found guilty, or if he simply wanted her out of the way, she might be imprisoned, forced into a convent, or quietly killed under the guise of divine justice. Peasant women fared no better. Without the resources to defend themselves, they could be dragged into public squares and punished before their neighbors. A mere rumor could be enough to spark punishment. And women who had been coerced, raped by lords, knights, or employers, were rarely believed. Consent was not a concern for the law. The blame always fell on the woman. What made adultery particularly tragic was that many women were trapped in loveless, abusive, or forced marriages. Some sought comfort, safety, or kindness in secret. But their society didn't allow nuance. Love was not an excuse. Pain was not a defense. Adultery erased everything else about a woman: her goodness, her suffering, her humanity. She was no longer a wife, mother, or person. She was a transgressor. And once labeled as such, she could never undo it. There were no second chances, no clean slates. Only the whisper of scandal in every room, the weight of judgment in every glance, and the memory of her punishment etched into stone or skin. In a world where a woman's appearance was both her currency and her curse, beauty in the Middle Ages was never safe. A beautiful woman could rise high in the favor of kings, lords, or wealthy patrons, but she also became a target. Envy, lust, suspicion, and control wrapped themselves around her like invisible chains. To be beautiful was to be watched, desired, feared, and blamed. From noble courts to village markets, beauty was seen as a dangerous gift, one that stirred temptation, disrupted marriages, and challenged men's control. If a man fell from grace due to an affair or obsession, the woman's beauty was blamed. If a rivalry broke out between men, it was said to be over her smile, her walk, her gaze. Women were rarely seen as agents of their own desire. They were seen as distractions, weapons, or traps. A man's sin became her fault. In noble circles, beauty could be used like a political tool. A charming woman might be married off to secure alliances or sent to court to gain favor. But the moment she stepped out of line, refusing an advance, drawing too much attention, or even aging, her value collapsed. Jealous wives could accuse her of seduction or sorcery. Powerful men could cast her aside without warning, replacing admiration with condemnation. Among peasants, beauty often brought danger rather than privilege. A pretty girl might be noticed by a knight or noble and taken, with no recourse or protection. If she resisted, she risked her life. If she didn't, she was branded immoral. Mothers sometimes tried to disguise their daughters with dirt or coarse clothing just to protect them from unwanted eyes. The fear was not superstition, it was survival. Even religion cast suspicion on beauty. The church warned women not to be vain, not to decorate themselves, not to tempt men. Beautiful women were urged to hide their looks beneath veils or modest dress to avoid pride. To be seen as too lovely was to be seen as sinful, simply by existing in a body that drew attention. And yet, the contradiction was everywhere. Beauty was celebrated in art and song, demanded by society, but punished when it appeared. A woman could not win. If she was beautiful, she was a danger. If she was plain, she was ignored. And if she used her beauty to gain even a sliver of power, she was accused of manipulation or worse. In a world obsessed with beauty, a woman's face could be her ruin. In the deeply religious fabric of medieval society, the church was not just a place of worship, it was the authority, the law, the voice of God. And for women, that voice was loud and clear: obey, submit, be silent. Scripture was used not to uplift them, but to bind them. Every passage interpreted, every sermon delivered, every rule enforced by the church reinforced one core message: women were lesser beings made to serve and suffer. The most influential text was the story of Eve. Her act in the Garden of Eden was preached as the origin of sin, and women were seen as her spiritual descendants, temptresses, weaker vessels, in constant need of guidance and control. Priests used this as justification for female silence in church, female submission in marriage, and female suffering as natural and deserved. Women were barred from preaching, barred from interpreting Scripture, and often barred from even reading it. Only through a man, father, husband, confessor, could they receive spiritual instruction. Her soul was not her own to guide. Confession, one of the few moments of religious agency a woman had, was also a double-edged sword. It required revealing her innermost thoughts to a male priest, often under pressure to confess imagined sins of vanity, desire, or disobedience. Her spiritual worth was measured in humility and silence. If she questioned a priest, she risked suspicion. If she spoke with too much certainty about her visions, dreams, or faith, she could be labeled heretical or possessed. Some women tried to carve space for themselves through mysticism. They claimed visions, divine inspiration, or spiritual marriages to Christ. While a few gained followers and were respected, many were later condemned, silenced, or burned. Their voices were heard only until they became inconvenient. Their holiness was accepted only if it didn't challenge the church's hierarchy. The church's control over women extended beyond the soul. It shaped laws, controlled marriages, monitored births, and dictated morality. A woman who failed to live up to the church's ideals, modesty, chastity, obedience, could be excommunicated or publicly shamed. Her salvation was always conditional, her freedom non-existent. Religion could offer comfort, but only if women accepted it on their knees. The faith that promised eternal peace also demanded earthly submission, and in this way, Scripture was weaponized. Not to save women, but to silence them. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not a union of love, it was a transaction, a contract, and for many women, a lifelong prison. From the moment she was born, a girl's future was shaped by marriage plans. Her family negotiated her fate through dowries, alliances, and status. She had no say. When the day came, she was handed over like property, sometimes to a man decades older, sometimes to a stranger. What followed was not partnership, it was ownership. The church sanctified marriage, but also codified a woman's subjugation within it. A wife was expected to obey her husband in all things. She could not deny him her body. She could not control her own movements, money, or decisions. If she disobeyed, she could be beaten, legally, within limits. The rule of thumb, a term used for the width of a stick a man might use on his wife, wasn't metaphorical. It was practice. and no one intervened unless the violence was public or extreme. Even the marriage ceremony itself symbolized submission. A woman promised to serve, honor, and obey. Her husband vowed to protect, but that protection often meant control. Her home became a cage. Her role, a script written by others. Even noble women, draped in jewels and silks, were not free. Their wealth only made them more valuable as bargaining tools, more closely watched, more tightly bound. If a woman fled her husband, she could be dragged back and punished. If she complained of cruelty, she was told to endure. Divorce was nearly impossible. Annulment required rare legal loopholes or high connections. For most, separation was unthinkable. She was bound to the man until death. Even widowhood offered little peace if her in-laws decided she owed them more years of service, caretaking, or silence. Some women found small ways to resist, through coded language, whispered prayers, hidden letters, or secret friendships. But these acts were quiet, and the walls of marriage remained high. She bore children she may not have wanted, shared a bed she had no choice in, smiled through dinners with guests who ignored her, all while knowing that her life, her body, her name were no longer hers. Marriage wasn't a blessing, it was a sentence, a woman's cage dressed in rings and rights. Of all the trials women faced in the Middle Ages, childbirth was among the most feared, and with good reason. Giving birth was not seen as a joyful milestone, but as a moment of mortal danger. Without modern medicine, clean tools, or reliable midwives, every labor could turn tragic. For many women, pregnancy was a death sentence dressed in hope. Pain relief did not exist. Midwives might offer herbal tinctures or whispered prayers, but the process was entirely natural, raw, and agonizing. If a labor stalled, there were no C-sections, no surgical interventions, just waiting, praying, and the slow creep of death if the child could not be delivered. A breech birth, a hemorrhage, an infection, any of these could kill the mother within hours. Even successful births could leave a woman with permanent injury or disability. Conditions like fistulas, prolapse, or torn muscles went untreated. She was expected to recover quickly and return to work or care duties, even if she could barely walk. The Church taught that this suffering was divine punishment, the pain of Eve, passed down through generations. Women were urged to embrace the agony as a form of spiritual purification. If a mother died during childbirth, her soul was often praised for its sacrifice. But if she survived with complications, she was rarely given help. Her weakness was her burden to bear alone. Worse still, childbirth often happened in isolation. Husbands rarely entered the birthing room. Physicians, if present, were usually reserved for wealthy women and were often more dangerous than helpful. The midwives, often wise and experienced, were later vilified during the witch hunts and driven underground. Poor women gave birth on straw floors, surrounded by a few neighbors. Noble women were confined to dark chambers with candles and priests. In neither case was safety guaranteed. And if the baby died, or if both mother and child died, it was treated as fate, not failure. Grief was swallowed. Burials were swift. There were no death certificates, no investigations, no comfort. Just silence, and the unspoken understanding that this was simply part of being a woman. To carry a child in the Middle Ages was to walk a tightrope between creation and annihilation. No one knew who would survive, but every woman knew someone who hadn't. In a society that prized sons above all else, daughters were born into second place. A boy was celebrated, his future imagined in swords, scrolls, or land. A girl was a burden, or at best, a tool. Her existence was acknowledged only when it served the ambitions of men. She was taught from infancy that her value lay in obedience, chastity, and eventual marriage. Her dreams, her talents, her inner life, none of it mattered unless it could be bent to fit the roles prescribed for her. Fathers rarely invested in their daughters' futures beyond arranging their marriages. Education, if offered at all, was shallow and functional: how to run a household, manage servants, recite prayers. Her brothers might be sent to study or train as knights. She would be taught how to sit still, speak softly, and carry herself in a way that attracted a worthy suitor. And once she was married, she was passed from one man's household to another, expected to bear children and stay silent. If she had brothers, she was often ignored. If she had only sisters, her family saw them as economic liabilities. Daughters meant dowries, expensive, draining, and essential. A father with too many daughters might rush to marry them off young, to whoever could afford the arrangement, regardless of the girl's safety or desires, and if no match could be made, a convent awaited. Or worse, a life of quiet servitude in a brother's home. In inheritance, she was almost always last. Property passed to sons, titles passed to sons, responsibility passed to sons. Even if she worked beside her father in his trade, she would never own the shop. If she tended the farm, she could not inherit the land. The law and the church alike saw her as temporary, never the future, only the present inconvenience. And yet, it was daughters who often nursed the sick, tended the dying, kept the home together when fathers and sons went off to war. Their labor was invisible, their sacrifice expected. And their achievements, if any, were erased the moment they married and lost their names. A daughter's life was one of near constant diminishment. She was born into the shadow of men and rarely allowed to step out. Honor was a powerful word in the Middle Ages, but it rarely belonged to women. Instead, it was placed upon them like a burden, a fragile veil they were forced to protect with every step, word, and breath. A woman's honor wasn't hers to define. It was measured by her chastity, her obedience, her silence, and if she lost it, or worse, had it taken from her, she lost everything. The concept of honor was deeply intertwined with a woman's sexuality. Virginity before marriage was considered sacred, not for the sake of the woman herself, but for her husband's pride and her family's reputation. Girls were warned, watched, and walled in. If a young woman was caught alone with a man, even if nothing occurred, whispers could ruin her chances of marriage. If she was assaulted, the shame fell on her, not the attacker. She became spoiled, no longer fit to be a bride. In many cases, her only option was to marry her abuser, if he agreed, or to disappear into a convent. Families policed their daughter's behavior with obsessive care. A brother might kill his sister's lover to restore family honor. A father might disown a daughter for disobedience. A woman who chose her own partner, spoke freely, or rejected a marriage proposal could be branded dishonorable, regardless of her reasons. Her feelings didn't matter. What mattered was how she was seen. Even in marriage, honor was a trap. A wife had to remain loyal, modest, and invisible outside her husband's presence. If she was accused of infidelity, even falsely, her reputation could be destroyed overnight. And if she protested mistreatment or abuse, she was seen as disloyal, dishonorable, someone who had failed in her sacred duty to preserve peace in the home. Silence was survival. The veil of honor was suffocating. It demanded perfection and punished humanity. A man could recover from scandal, rebuild a name, remake his life. A woman, once marked, remained stained forever in the eyes of society. Her worth crumbled, her options vanished, and her future was rewritten in shame. Honor was not protection, it was a leash, a fragile illusion used to control women and to blame them for the violence and injustice done to them. Obedience wasn't just expected of medieval women, it was demanded, enforced, and glorified. From birth to death, a woman's life was a series of commands handed down from fathers, husbands, priests, and lords. She was not taught to think for herself, but to follow. Her loyalty was measured by her silence, her virtue by her submission, and any deviation from this obedience was seen as dangerous, even evil. As a girl, she obeyed her parents. As a wife, she obeyed her husband. As a widow or nun, she obeyed the church. In every stage of life, obedience was her safety and her prison. The moment she questioned, resisted, or hesitated, she became a threat to the order of things. Obedient women were praised in sermons and stories. Disobedient ones were punished or erased from memory. This obedience was not just about actions, it extended to thought and belief. A woman was expected to accept her role without complaint. If she dreamed of travel, of learning, of love that didn't fit her family's plans, those dreams had to be buried. If she saw injustice, she was to stay quiet. If she experienced cruelty, she was to endure it. The church preached that obedience brought grace, that suffering was holy, and that resistance was sin. Even noble women, with access to education and influence, walked a tightrope. A politically minded wife might advise her husband behind closed doors, but if she spoke too freely, she risked scandal. A peasant woman might manage an entire household, but if she defied her husband publicly, she could be beaten, or worse. Laws supported the right of husbands to discipline their wives within reason, a vague phrase that left women vulnerable to control by fear. Some women internalized this system, believing it to be the natural order. Others rebelled in small ways, through letters, songs, hidden gatherings. But most simply survived within it, learning how to bend without breaking. Because to be labeled disobedient was to invite judgment, isolation, or even death. Obedience was not a virtue freely chosen. It was a survival tactic in a world where a woman's life was not her own. Autonomy, the ability to make decisions for oneself, was a luxury few women in the Middle Ages ever knew. From birth, every major choice in a woman's life was made for her. Her parents chose her future. Her husband managed her daily existence. The church dictated her beliefs and behaviors. Even her body was subject to laws and customs she had no voice in. She could not choose where to live, who to marry, how many children to bear, or what kind of life to pursue. Her life was a set path she was forced to walk, regardless of whether her feet ever wanted to move. A girl might be promised in marriage before she understood the meaning of the word. Her family's decision was final, sealed by dowries and contracts. If she refused, she brought shame, or even punishment, upon herself and her kin. Once married, she could not own property independently. Her earnings belonged to her husband. Her choices were filtered through his approval. She could not leave without his permission. She could not make legal decisions. Even her words, if uttered in defiance, could be treated as insubordination. For peasant women, life was no freer. The lord of the manor controlled where she lived, what she grew, whom she paid rent to. Her work was never compensated equally. And though she often carried the burden of both field and household labor, she had no say in how resources were used or distributed. The more she toiled, the more invisible she became. For noble women, appearances of influence masked deeper dependence. A wealthy lady might manage a household, commission a tapestry, or write letters to other nobles, but her actions still required the consent of men. If her husband died, she might serve as regent for a son, but she did not rule in her own name. Even queens, the most powerful women in the realm, were scrutinized, controlled, and often overthrown when they exercised too much will. And beyond all roles and ranks, the church loomed, reminding every woman that submission was godly. Autonomy was seen not as a right, but as rebellion. A woman who tried to forge her own path through knowledge, love, or leadership was dangerous. Better to be obedient, silent, contained. To be a woman in the Middle Ages was to live inside a fortress of restrictions. Doors were locked before you ever saw them, and the keys, they were never meant for you. Purity was not just a religious concept in medieval society, it was a weapon. From the moment she could speak, a girl was taught that her value came from her virtue. her virginity wasn't a private matter. It was a public asset, a family treasure, a social currency. Her worth was measured not by her intelligence or spirit, but by her ability to remain pure. And if she lost that status, by choice or by force, her life could be ruined. This obsession with purity created a cruel paradox. A woman's body was seen as inherently shameful, yet she was expected to keep it spotless. She had to be attractive enough to marry, but untouched. She had to dress modestly but still catch a suitor's eye. She had to resist desire entirely but be ready to perform when her husband demanded. She was not allowed to understand her own sexuality, much less enjoy it. To express interest, or even curiosity, was enough to be labeled impure. If a woman was raped, the community often treated her as if she were the criminal. Her purity was seen as broken, her reputation damaged, regardless of her innocence. And in some places, her only hope for restoring that reputation was to marry her attacker. The burden of shame always rested on the victim, not the perpetrator. Virginity was so prized that some young women were physically inspected before marriage. Hymen tests, bridal night rituals, blood-stained sheets, these gruesome proofs became social performances of chastity. And if a bride failed the test, her marriage could be annulled, her dowry returned, her name disgraced. The Church reinforced these ideas with sermons, confessions, and cautionary tales. Virgin saints were exalted, while fallen women were demonized. Purity was seen not only as a moral duty, but a path to salvation. Those who died pure were promised heaven. Those who didn't, judgment, both divine and earthly. A woman's soul was tied to her sexual status. And what of love? Romance was allowed only within the tight bounds of marriage and expectation. Passion outside of that was sin. Exploration was vice. Joy without approval was punishable. The purity ideal didn't protect women, it imprisoned them, body and mind. Purity was not a gift, it was a leash disguised as virtue. In the medieval world, a dowry was far more than a tradition, it was a price tag. It reduced women to commodities, assets to be traded in exchange for social gain, political alliance, or economic stability. Behind every marriage negotiation lay a transaction, land for virtue, livestock for beauty, silver for silence. A woman's value was calculated in coin and property, and if her family couldn't afford to meet the price, she became a burden too heavy to bear. Dowries varied by class. For noble women, dowries were vast, estates, castles, cattle, and coin passed between families to secure alliances and uphold prestige. Marriages weren't sealed with affection but with parchment and wax seals, documents that measured a girl's future in acres and gold. For the wealthy, a daughter's marriage was a strategy. Her body carried bloodlines and inheritance, and she was expected to bear sons who would continue her husband's name, not her own. For poor families, dowries were more modest, linens, livestock, tools, or even labor promises. But the pressure was just as suffocating. Many girls were married off early, simply to ease the financial burden they placed on the household. And when no dowry could be scraped together, the options dwindled to cloisters, servitude, or permanent spinsterhood, each carrying its own stigma. A girl without a dowry wasn't just unlucky. She was invisible. A woman had no control over the terms of her dowry. It was negotiated by fathers and uncles, overseen by priests or lords, and enforced by contracts that often left her with nothing. If her husband died, she might not inherit a single coin of what her dowry purchased. If she displeased him, he could return her to her family in disgrace, while keeping her dowry. And if her family later fell into debt or dishonor, she might be recalled from marriage like a failed investment. Even worse, dowries could become tools of coercion. A young woman might be threatened into compliance. Do as you're told or we won't pay your dowry. Sisters might be turned against each other. each struggling to seem the most worthy of investment. It wasn't love that guided these decisions, it was survival and the cruel arithmetic of patriarchal wealth. In every case, the dowry reminded women that they were never free agents. They were investments, leverage, and currency. Their worth was not in their minds or hearts, but in their market value, and once spent, they could never be fully reclaimed. Few things condemned a woman more swiftly in the medieval era than being accused of betrayal, whether it was betrayal of her husband, her family, her faith, or her role. And betrayal didn't always mean treason or secrets whispered to enemies. It could be something as simple as a spoken truth, an act of love outside marriage, or even daring to want more than what was assigned to her. Betrayal, for a woman, was often just living honestly in a world that didn't want her to. The most common accusation was marital betrayal. An unfaithful wife, real or suspected, was seen as a threat to social order. Her body was her husband's property. Her children were supposed to be his. To betray that bond was to unravel everything patriarchy held sacred. Punishments were harsh and public: banishment, flogging, public humiliation, or execution. Her lover, if identified, might receive a slap on the wrist or walk away entirely untouched. But betrayal extended beyond bedsheets. A woman who protected an outlawed child, helped a heretic, refused a marriage, or converted to another faith could also be branded as treacherous. Daughters who disobeyed their fathers, wives who spoke against their husbands, nuns who left their cloisters, each was seen as breaking the chain of obedience that bound medieval society together. Sometimes the accusation of betrayal was used to remove a woman who had become inconvenient. A nobleman who grew tired of his wife might invent slights to have her cast out. A woman of influence might be accused of undermining male authority just for speaking too well or too often. The label traitor gave men license to silence women without consequence. Branded women carried their shame for life, sometimes literally, with hot irons pressed to their skin, marking them as faithless or impure. Others were figuratively branded, forced to wear signs, locked in stocks, or paraded through town as warnings. These women were not forgotten. They were remembered for all the wrong reasons, their reputations twisted and passed down through hushed gossip and official record alike. And betrayal could happen in reverse. Women were betrayed by husbands who beat them, families who sold them, churches that silenced them, and courts that refused to hear them. Yet their cries went unanswered. The world only saw betrayal when it served the patriarchy, not when it devastated the lives of women. In truth, many of these women weren't traitors at all. They were simply brave. But in the Middle Ages, bravery in a woman was just another kind of betrayal. In a world ruled by fear and the unknown, superstition was a powerful force, and women bore the brunt of it. Every bad harvest, every sudden illness, every miscarriage or thunderstorm had to be explained. And more often than not, society turned to the easiest scapegoat, a woman. Not because she had caused the suffering, but because her presence, her knowledge, her independence, her mere existence was too threatening to be ignored. Women were seen as closer to nature, and in a world where nature was often cruel and unpredictable, this closeness became suspicion. Midwives, herbalists, and healers, those who held ancient knowledge passed down from generations, were accused of interfering with God's will. If they helped a woman give birth safely, they were considered lucky. If the child died, they were witches. There was no win. Their skill was admired until it was feared. Their remedies were trusted until they weren't. But it wasn't just healers. A woman who spoke to herself, who sang in the woods, who had vivid dreams or suffered from epilepsy or mental illness, could be accused of being cursed or of cursing others. Menstruation, pregnancy, menopause, natural stages of life, were treated as signs of spiritual contamination. Women were told to stay out of churches during their periods. If they gave birth to a deformed child, it was seen as punishment for sin. Superstition wasn't simply personal belief. It was woven into law, faith, and justice. Women accused of cursing livestock or causing illness were brought before local courts, tried without evidence, and sentenced based on rumors or visions. Even noble women could fall victim if they stepped out of line or gathered too much influence. The higher they climbed, the further they could fall under suspicion of unnatural power. This fear of the feminine and the unknown led to public punishments. Women were forced to confess to impossible crimes, confessing they flew through the air, turned into animals, or poisoned wells, often under torture. These confessions were then used to prove how dangerous all women could be if left unchecked. Superstition didn't just justify violence, it demanded it. The cruelest irony? Many of the women targeted were the ones who helped their communities the most. They nursed the sick, soothed the dying, and delivered the next generation. But when something went wrong, something no one could explain, they became the monsters hiding in plain sight. Superstition shackled women in fear, suspicion, and silence. It made their very nature a liability, and their wisdom a crime. Medieval warfare devastated everyone, but women suffered in ways that left no battlefield scars, only generational wounds. When armies moved, they didn't just march with swords and banners. They brought destruction, famine, rape, disease, and the collapse of the fragile social order that held women's lives together. War wasn't a distant male affair. It came straight to the doorstep, and when it did, women were almost always the first to pay the price. During sieges and raids, women were captured, killed, or assaulted in staggering numbers. It was common for invading forces to view local women as part of the spoils of victory. They were raped, enslaved, or forced into marriage. Even pregnant women weren't spared. And if they survived, they were left behind to pick up the pieces, alone, traumatized, and often shunned. For noble women, war brought other dangers. Their castles might be targeted. Their husbands marched away and never returned. If they were captured, they could be ransomed, held hostage, or even forced into sexual or political servitude. Some acted as temporary rulers or defenders, but these rare exceptions didn't protect them from the violence and judgment of a world that refused to see them as equals. Peasant women faced even grimmer realities. Crops were trampled, homes burned, children starved, widows were left with no means to survive. War turned fields into graves and left entire villages filled with women and children begging for food, shelter, and mercy from lords who had no more to give. And the suffering didn't stop when the swords were sheathed. War bred famine, famine bred disease, disease bred isolation. Women were left to care for the sick with no supplies, no aid, and no support. Those who dared to steal food or break curfews were punished harshly. Many sold their bodies to feed their families, only to be condemned as immoral for surviving the only way they could. Perhaps most cruelly, women were erased from war stories. Chronicles praised kings, knights, and battles. They didn't record the women who buried their husbands, fled with their children, or died in burned cottages. Their suffering became invisible, tolerated, expected, forgotten. War didn't make women heroes in the eyes of history. It made them victims, silent, scattered, and shattered by battles they never chose. In a society where women had little legal voice and even less protection, being accused of a crime, real or imagined, was often a death sentence. Medieval justice did not require proof in the way we understand it today. Hearsay, suspicion, or the mere fact of being disliked could be enough to draw a woman into a nightmare of accusations, public shaming, and punishment. Worse still, many women never saw a fair trial. They were condemned before they ever had the chance to speak. Justice was never neutral. It bent toward the powerful and the male. A nobleman's word outweighed a servant's truth. A husband's accusation held more weight than a wife's defense. And a priest's judgment was treated as divine certainty. For women, especially poor or unmarried ones. Even defending themselves could be seen as defiance, and defiance only deepened the charge. Once accused, a woman might be subjected to ordeal, one of the most brutal forms of medieval proof. She might be forced to walk across burning coals, retrieve stones from boiling water, or be thrown into a river to see if she floated. Floating meant guilt, sinking meant innocence, but often death. These were not tests of fact. They were rituals of control, designed to silence the accused through fear and pain. Women accused of theft, adultery, blasphemy, witchcraft, or simply disruptive behavior could be sentenced to whipping, branding, mutilation, or execution. But just as terrifying as the punishment was the spectacle, these women were made examples, paraded before townsfolk, displayed on pillories, written into public record as warnings to others. Their humiliation was theater, and the crowd was part of the sentence. Sometimes, no formal accusation was even necessary. A woman might be dragged from her home in the night by angry neighbors or religious zealots. She might be punished simply for being in the wrong place, wearing the wrong thing, or speaking with the wrong man. And when she protested, she was labeled hysterical, sinful, or possessed. Her voice was not only unwanted, it was criminal. The system didn't seek truth. It sought obedience. And any woman who broke that expectation, by accident or by courage, could be destroyed without a shred of evidence. To be a woman in medieval Europe was to live under constant risk of accusation, judgment, and punishment, without justice, without mercy, and all too often, without a voice. History is not just about what happened, it's about who was allowed to be remembered. And for most women of the Middle Ages, their stories were erased, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. Their contributions, their pain, their strength, their survival, none of it was considered worthy of recording. Chroniclers, monks, and scribes wrote about kings, battles, saints, and laws. Women were mentioned only when they served a purpose, as brides, mothers of heirs, or cautionary tales. The names of women who built, farmed, healed, taught, or led quietly in their communities have been lost. The songs they sang, the letters they wrote, the dreams they whispered by candlelight, vanished into the silence of the past. Even noble women, who lived in castles and courts, were often summarized in footnotes. She bore 5 sons. She died in childbirth. That was her life, reduced to a sentence. And if a woman did something remarkable, led a rebellion, commanded a household during war, healed the sick during plague, her story was often attributed to a man or dismissed as legend. Truths became rumors. Achievements became myths. Women who didn't fit the mold were simply written out. This erasure wasn't just accidental, it was intentional. The scribes were men, the power was male, the narratives were controlled. Female voices that challenged the dominant structure were either silenced or branded as mad, wicked, or demonic. Even the records that survived were filtered through prejudice, letters burned, art defaced, names forgotten. Yet, despite all this, traces remain. Marginal notes in manuscripts, graffiti scratched into walls, folk songs passed down through generations. These remnants whisper of the women who lived, fought, and dreamed behind the curtain of recorded history. They remind us that absence is not the same as insignificance. Women were everywhere in the Middle Ages, working, surviving, shaping their world in quiet and unseen ways. Their erasure is a wound in history, and recovering their stories is a rebellion against centuries of silence. In a world where nearly every aspect of a woman's life was controlled, even the smallest act of resistance could feel revolutionary. Defiance didn't always come with swords or banners, it came in whispers, glances, carefully chosen words, or quiet refusals. For medieval women, survival often meant submission. But every so often, some chose to resist, and while their rebellions were often crushed, they left behind a legacy of courage that refused to be buried. Some women refused arranged marriages, running away from their families despite the dangers. Others defied religious expectations, slipping away from convent walls or openly questioning church doctrines. Female artisans disguised themselves as men to enter forbidden trades. Wives poisoned abusive husbands. Daughters fled oppressive homes to live on their own terms, even if it meant poverty and isolation. These women knew the risks. To rebel was to invite shame, violence, or death. But desperation made the risk worth taking. Their actions weren't born of ambition, they were born of suffocation. In defying the roles forced upon them, these women seized scraps of autonomy in a world built to deny them everything. Some joined revolts alongside peasants, demanding justice in uprisings that history rarely mentions. Others became outlaws, hiding in forests or borderlands, living far outside the reach of societal norms. And then, there were the quiet rebels, women who taught girls to read in secret, who practiced forbidden healing, who dared to write poetry about freedom. These weren't always grand gestures. Sometimes defiance looked like refusing to kneel, refusing to marry, refusing to stay silent. But in a world where obedience was the law of life, any refusal was a battle cry. History didn't praise these women. It often punished them. Their names were lost, their stories twisted, their motives questioned. But their defiance carved cracks in the walls of oppression, cracks that centuries later would grow into windows of change. They remind us that even in the darkest times, resistance burns quietly in the hearts of those denied their freedom. Not all women were forced into marriage or servitude. Some found themselves behind the stone walls of convents. For some, this was a prison. For others, it was a sanctuary. The cloistered life offered medieval women one of the very few paths that could lead to a form of autonomy, learning, and even leadership. But it came at the cost of personal freedom, and often was chosen not by the woman herself, but by her family. Noble families commonly sent second or third daughters to nunneries. It reduced the burden of dowries and served as a way to gain favor with the church. Some girls entered the convent as children, taking vows before they even understood what they meant. Others were widows, unwanted wives, or those judged unsuitable for marriage. Once inside, their lives were governed by strict rules: silence, prayer, obedience, and discipline. And yet, behind these walls, something rare happened. Women studied. They copied manuscripts, read scripture, practiced music, and tended gardens. Some became abbesses, managing land and people with authority denied to them outside the cloister. A few even corresponded with bishops or kings. In a world that feared female knowledge, the convent was paradoxically one of the few places it could grow. But life wasn't always peaceful. Convents could be cold, overcrowded, and poor. Harsh punishments awaited those who questioned authority or broke rules. Emotional isolation was real. And for those forced into religious life against their will, the daily rituals could feel like slow suffocation. There were also political dangers. During periods of reform, some nunneries were seized or shut down. Nuns could be forced out or accused of corruption. And if one of them spoke too boldly, she might face charges of heresy or witchcraft, especially if her influence grew too large. Still, for many women, the cloister was the only space where they could exist apart from the expectations of wifehood and motherhood. It was both cage and refuge, prison and possibility. In those quiet stone halls, medieval women carved out lives of reflection, scholarship, and subtle power, proof that even in confinement, the mind could still roam free. In the courts of kings and the halls of noble families, medieval women were often treated not as individuals, but as strategic pawns, valuable only for what alliances they could secure, what lands they could bring, or what heirs they could produce. Politics was a brutal game, and women were its most exploited pieces. Their marriages weren't about love or companionship. They were about borders, treaties, and dynasties. From the moment she was born into a noble house, a girl became a potential alliance. Kings promised daughters to rivals to secure peace. Dukes used their sisters to curry favor with more powerful lords. Even children could be pledged in marriage before they could speak. These contracts were sealed with signatures and bloodlines, long before the girls involved knew what it meant to be a wife, let alone a mother. Once married, a noblewoman became an extension of her husband's interests. If he was loyal, she had status. If he was accused of treason, she was disgraced. If he died, she might be swiftly remarried to another political ally, her grief irrelevant to the calculations of power. She was expected to manage the household, oversee estates, and produce male heirs, each child a potential continuation of the alliance. Sometimes, women were used more directly in diplomacy. They acted as hostages, exchanged like currency to guarantee peace. A daughter might be sent to a foreign court where she knew no one, spoke a different language, and had no protection. If her marriage failed to produce political gains, she was blamed. If tensions rose again, she could be abandoned, or worse, used as a target to send a message. Even queens were not exempt. Their titles were often symbolic, their power contingent on the men around them. A queen could be crowned yet still treated as a vessel, praised for birthing sons, vilified if she didn't. Many were forced into public displays of fertility or piety, as if their worth needed constant reinforcement. And if a woman dared to use her position to influence policy, write letters, or negotiate with other nobles, she was accused of meddling, manipulation, or witchcraft. Her intelligence became a liability. Her ambition, a threat. Political women in the Middle Ages walked a knife's edge, revered as figureheads, discarded as liabilities, and punished the moment they stepped out of their assigned role. Motherhood was seen as the highest calling for medieval women, but it was also the most perilous. To bear children was expected, glorified, and spiritually charged, yet it came with overwhelming physical danger, emotional pressure, and cultural obligation. A woman's value as a mother was not measured in love, but in how many healthy sons she could deliver, and how quietly she could endure the pain. The expectation began early. As soon as a woman was married, pregnancy was expected. If months passed without a child, rumors of infertility whispered through the household. And when a child finally came, there was no guarantee of safety. As described in earlier chapters, childbirth was often a life-threatening event. Surviving the delivery was only the beginning. A mother's duty didn't end at birth, it intensified. She was expected to feed, clean, educate, discipline, and protect her children with little rest or aid. Wet nurses were only available to the wealthy. Most mothers, especially among the poor, returned to field work or domestic labor almost immediately after giving birth, carrying infants on their backs or leaving them with older siblings. And the loss of a child, a tragically common occurrence, was treated with brutal practicality. With high infant mortality rates, death was expected. Mourning was brief, if allowed at all. Some women lost child after child, burying each one with their own hands. Yet society offered no comfort, only a grim shrug of fate. Mothers of noble status faced different pressures. They were expected to produce heirs. Daughters were less celebrated. Miscarriages, stillbirths, or multiple daughters in a row could cause a woman to fall out of favor with her husband or his court. Some were discarded, divorced, or sent to convents when they failed to meet these cold reproductive expectations. And the emotional toll? It didn't matter. There was no discussion of postpartum depression, no understanding of maternal exhaustion, no room to express grief. A woman's pain, both physical and emotional, was seen as part of her divine role. To complain was to be weak, to struggle was to be sinful. Yet, despite all this, women continued to mother with strength and sacrifice. They cradled the sick, fed the hungry, defended their children during famine, plague, and war. They passed down stories, songs, and wisdom in quiet defiance of a world that never gave them the recognition they deserved. Motherhood in the Middle Ages was not just a role. It was a battlefield, fought in blood, silence, and love that often went unnoticed and unrewarded. In medieval Europe, religion was not just a spiritual guide, it was a tool of power, and when wielded against women, it became a weapon used to suppress, control, and punish. The Church shaped every part of medieval life, from the moment of birth to the moment of death. And its teachings told women, in no uncertain terms, that they were the weaker vessel, sinful by nature, prone to temptation, and in constant need of male guidance. From childhood, girls were taught that Eve's disobedience had brought sin into the world. Her story was repeated endlessly, not as myth, but as justification for the hardships women endured. Because of Eve, pain in childbirth was not just a biological reality, it was a divine punishment. Because of Eve, women were told to obey their husbands, stay silent in church, and accept suffering as a pathway to salvation. Priests and monks wrote sermons warning men of the dangers of female temptation. They painted women as seductresses, distractions from holy life. Even widows and nuns, those who had rejected worldly desire, were reminded constantly of their natural weakness. They were instructed to pray more, speak less, and never overstep the bounds of their gender. And when a woman dared to challenge the religious order by preaching, writing, or questioning doctrine, she was swiftly condemned. Heresy and witchcraft were the catch-all charges. Female mystics who spoke of divine visions walked a fine line between sainthood and execution. Their spiritual experiences were accepted only when they aligned with church authority. If not, their words were branded as madness or manipulation. Confession and penance also became means of control. Women were instructed to confess every impure thought, every misstep, every act of defiance. Priests held power not just over souls, but over secrets. Confessionals became places where shame was reinforced, where guilt was implanted deep into the psyche of women trying to survive in an unforgiving world. Even the saints reflected this double standard. Virgin martyrs were glorified. Mothers were honored only if they suffered. Women who lived full lives of joy, love, or rebellion were erased or recast as cautionary tales. Religion could offer comfort. It could inspire acts of compassion and hope. But for most women in the Middle Ages, it was a collar around the neck, tightening every time they stepped out of line. Even after the Middle Ages ended, the silence imposed on medieval women echoed forward for centuries. Their stories were not passed down in textbooks. Their experiences were not celebrated in poems or recorded in statues. The history of women in this era was buried, not because it wasn't important, but because it was inconvenient, uncomfortable, and challenging to the myths of progress and glory that society preferred to tell. Most historical records focused on kings, battles, and conquests. Chronicles didn't write about the girl who died in childbirth at 15, or the woman who raised 10 children alone during famine, or the nun who translated scripture in secret. Their contributions were invisible, their lives undocumented. Even when women did appear in records, their identities were often reduced to roles: wife of, daughter of, widow of. Their thoughts, desires, and resistance were left unwritten. And because historians relied on these documents to build narratives, generations of scholars repeated the silence, assuming that women simply hadn't done anything worth remembering. But that assumption is being challenged. Today, historians are beginning to uncover the fragments left behind: letters hidden in bindings, names scratched into convent walls, wills that mention daughters, not just sons. Each piece reveals another life once thought lost. And as those stories come to light, they demand that we rethink not just what happened in the past, but who was allowed to speak. The silence wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a pattern, a system, and breaking it now is a form of justice, resurrecting voices long buried beneath the weight of history. Women in the Middle Ages weren't silent, they were silenced, and now, finally, we're beginning to hear them again. In the brutal world of the Middle Ages, simply staying alive as a woman was an act of defiance. Survival required endurance, cunning, strength, and a quiet kind of rebellion that history rarely celebrates. While the powerful wrote chronicles of battles and kings, women fought a war of their own against hunger, cold, abuse, and invisibility. Every day a woman lived, worked, mothered, healed, or dreamed was a small rebellion against a society built to crush her. Survival looked different for every woman. For the peasant wife, it meant rising before dawn to work fields, haul water, bake bread, and raise children, all while knowing she would never own the land she worked or control the family she birthed. For the noblewoman, it meant navigating the dangerous politics of court, staying useful but not threatening, speaking just enough, and producing heirs without faltering. For the nun, it meant finding meaning in silence, isolation, and duty, and carving out identity through prayer and scholarship. Women passed knowledge to one another in secret: which herbs to use, how to ease childbirth, how to mend wounds, how to cope with grief. They told stories, sang lullabies, painted symbols, and taught daughters in hushed voices. These were not the grand, sweeping victories of kings, but they were victories all the same. Each act of care was an act of resistance in a world that tried to convince women they were powerless. Even laughter, in a world of sorrow, was resistance. So was kindness. So was refusing to give in. Women consoled each other after loss, found moments of joy in song and season, supported each other during childbirth and plague. Through these quiet, shared acts, they built strength not written in books, but woven into generations. The stories of women who survived the Middle Ages, without fame, without record, without reward, are the threads that hold the real history together. They remind us that resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it simply keeps going. As we close this descent into the pure hell that was life for women in the Middle Ages, there's one truth that cuts through all the silence, pain, and injustice. These women mattered. Their lives were not side notes in history. They were not shadows or passive victims. They were real, flesh and blood, heartbreak and hope. And though many of their names have been lost, the echo of their existence still rings through time. We must remember them, not just the queens and saints, but the midwives, mothers, rebels, writers, servants, and countless unnamed girls who lived and died beneath the weight of a world that never saw their worth. Each of them bore burdens that would break most of us today. They endured isolation, cruelty, control, and grief, and they did so without the luxuries of choice, support, or recognition. To remember them is not only to honor their strength, it is to reclaim a history that belongs to all of us. Their suffering was real, but so was their courage. Their silence was enforced, but now it can be broken. When we say their names, or seek them out from the dust of forgotten manuscripts and erased records, we stitch them back into the story from which they were torn. The Middle Ages were not kind to women, but through history, art, and memory, we can offer them what their own time never did: dignity, visibility, and truth. We can remind the world that they lived, that they mattered, and that they are still here, in the stories we tell and in the justice we seek.